that all of you experienced conflict at some stage in your personal or professional lives. It's sort of endemic in the world, isn't it? And again, something as simple as passive aggressive behavior through to all-out war. And a lot of it can be avoided. And maybe we try to do something creative and something positive. A lot of it is simply, I think, a misunderstanding. And by that, I mean not understanding ourselves and not understanding others. And today's webinar with Mora is really going to address these issues. How can you understand yourself? How can you understand others? How can you understand the triggers that cause conflict? Now, at the end of today's webinar, to encourage you to stay the course, Mora and myself are giving a free gift. We're giving you a Psychometrics EQ report. So when I post more of my contact details in the chat at the end, there'll be a link there. And by simply emailing me, I'll send you a unique password so you can complete this assessment. And this will tell you how you behave, how you like to behave and do things, what you value, what's important to you. And finally, your EQ, how active you are in the areas of emotional intelligence. So don't forget to pay attention to that at the end when we complete. Now, if you have questions, also, I'd like you to just post them in the chat. At the end of the webinar, Mora will answer your questions. And if we don't get to them all, we will have them there and we will answer you directly by email or in a link. So I'd like to introduce Mora. Mora Byrne. If you just share your screen there, Mora.
Yes, I'm doing it now. Hello, everybody. Great to not see everybody, but know you're all there. And thank you all so much for joining us this afternoon. It's great that you could.
Yeah, thanks, Mora. So let me introduce Mora. Mora is an interesting lady, to say the least. An executive business coach, very successful one, I should add. I mean, as an example, she's worked with Brendan Company Healthcare for the last 3 years, coaching and doing webinars with 19 of their senior people. And Brendan's have just been, I believe, Mora, correct me if I'm wrong, I think they've just been awarded Deloitte Best Managed Company.
They have, absolutely, which they're very proud about.
Yep, well done. Congratulations. Good, great.
Well, there was obviously other things involved besides that, but certainly the coaching helped.
Yeah. Mora is also a mentor, a behavior, motivation, EQ analyst, a marketing graduate, an entrepreneur, a founder of Horizon, and a published children's author. Multi-talented, Mora.
Well, the writing, the creative writing is good, and this is a different type of business, but I can still use some of my skills, my writing skills, obviously, in this business as well.
Very good. So, Mora, can you tell us, just by way of introduction, can you tell us what are you going to cover in the webinar today?
Okay, thanks, Porrick. Thanks for that introduction. Okay, so the things that we'll cover today in the webinar are just an overview of why conflict occurs. The second thing is how self-awareness and understanding our triggers reduces conflict. I love talking about triggers. What is EQ, emotional quotient, and how it can help reduce conflict. And then the SCARF model for conflict and how that works. So how you could use it in your job, you know, if you're managing people, how you could use the SCARF model around that. So let's start. I mean, the cost of conflict, workplace conflict, is enormous. We're talking about a figure of 359 billion per year in the US alone. There's, I mean, that's an enormous amount of cost for companies. And the things that cause that, I suppose the costs that are involved in that are, I suppose, attrition is a huge one. You know, to replace a senior person in an organization is recommended, or is about 250% of their salary. A more junior person, about 100% of salary. You know, you've obviously got things like productivity reduction, You know, and the most urgent thing, I suppose, of the whole lot with conflict is that people are unhappy, and there can be mental health issues and problems where people are unhappy. So conflict is really a huge issue. It can affect relationship, you know, the reputation of the company and that as well. So it really has to be addressed. And here are some ideas for it. So the first thing we're going to do, Porrick's going to moderate that, is the poll, Porrick. There are two types of conflicts, essentially. So there is conflict that's caused by task or process issues, and then there's relationship issues. So this is confidential, obviously. So it'd be really interesting if you could just tell me, in your experience, people who are attending today, which has been the most, you know, the one that you've noticed the most in terms of, you know, your reaction to conflict or causing conflict in your organization. So just to see, let's have a look and see what people have found themselves, you know, in relation to conflict that they've experienced.
We have 30 people responded so far. Interesting.
Okay.
People clicking away there. They are.
Great.
And I can tell you right now that the balance is over 4 to 1. But we'll see which one this is at the end.
Okay, so 4 to 1. Is that relation or task?
I won't say more until I see, until everybody is finished.
Okay. Right.
So anybody who's there, just click, just answer the question. The workplace conflict you are or have experienced is caused by either. So pick one of them, task or process or relational issues, and just click on the button, and we get a score. So the score so far, we have 37 responses. Okay, so I'll give you the score. I think it's probably, we'll do it now. We'll pop it up there. So here's the results coming up there. Can you see the result?
Yeah, it's 76%.
I don't have an answer for that. Is there something else?
That's hilarious. That's Siri trying to answer the question for me. So the result is 24% say task process issue.
Yeah.
And 76% are saying relationship issue or relational issue. Does that surprise you, Mora?
Yeah, I thought it'd be more 50-50. I've done this a few times before, and it has been around 50-50. So that's interesting. And I'm not sure if that's to do with the times that we're in, you know, that people are more stressed, you know, with COVID, or people being out of the office and whatever. But it's very interesting. It's quite high then, the relationship side. Okay, so just moving on then, in relation to just to talk about TTI, since Porrick and I are doing this together, one good way, a scientific way, if you like, of discovering, you know, the differences between people and working out what people in a team, for example, would have in common, and what maybe they don't have in common, and their differences, is to do psychometric testing. And it's a really brilliant way of really working out when you're managing a team, of what particular motivators people have, and different people, and then also then doing a team workshop around that, you know, around understanding each other's similarities and understanding each other's differences, and that does help to reduce conflict. So if we move on to the next one, I love this little image here. It's of a brain, and it's that lovely knitted wool and everything, the brain and the heart. And that's the perfect thing to have. It doesn't always work, of course. The perfect thing to have, where the two are working together, you know, intellect and the heart, the emotional quotient, are working together. And I don't have slides on this, but if we did slides around, you know, when people get triggered, and, you know, in your brain lights up if you see something as a threat, or if you see something as a reward. So that, again, in the landscape of conflict is, you know, there's a hugely scientific reason why conflict occurs. It's around emotions as well. So if we want to talk then about the sort of mainstay of conflict and reducing conflict, EQ is really where we're really at. Is, you know, the higher your EQ, the better you are going to be able to deal with conflict and to, you know, reduce conflict. So there's two parts to EQ. There's intrapersonal EQ and interpersonal EQ. So the intrapersonal is self-awareness, and triggers as part of that. We'll talk about that in a minute. Self-regulation and motivation. And then the interpersonal part of it is social awareness and social regulation. So you can see that this is going to be very important. So it's all to do with empathy. So if you have high EQ or high EQ run-led organizations, you're going to have psychological safety for all of the team, all the people. So people will feel very safe in their working environment. They'll feel that it's open. They will trust their manager. There'll be a very, very strong culture, and there is less likely to be conflict. I'm not saying that there isn't a conflict. There's, as we were saying earlier, conflict can lead to creativity, but we're talking about the toxic conflict. And then you have a sort of if you've high EQ led and high EQ organization, it's going to be people centered, and the culture comes before the strategy. And you see, that's a big problem with conflict, because a lot of conflict occurs when the strategy is number one, you know, and people are working against plans and timelines. And, you know, they're, for whatever reason, they're finding that they're getting into conflict. You know, that maybe the budgets aren't enough. The financial budgets aren't enough for the plans or the strategy that's been set. Maybe there isn't enough people to do the work. And this is where all this conflict then starts to build up. So organizations who put the people first, are people-centered, always have less conflict. So again, if we drill down into this a little bit, and I'm going to move my screens over a tiny bit. If you look at this chart here, you'll see emotional intelligence to explain it a little bit better. So you've got the self and the social there. Emotional intelligence is your ability to recognize and understand emotions in yourself and others, and your ability to use this awareness to manage your behavior and relationships. So that they're the key things here, is that you're managing. If everybody has the emotional intelligence and everybody's very self-aware and they've got good empathy, then they're able to manage themselves in a situation that might be causing conflict or resistance. And they're also aware of other people, and they're, you know, able to manage that to the behaviors. So if we look at the self and self-awareness, that's the ability to recognize and understand your moods, your emotions, your drives, as well as your effect on others. Okay, so when you're self-aware, you know who you are, and you know, if you say certain things, that has an effect on people as well. And then the self-management part of it, extremely, extremely important. The ability to control or redirect disruptive influences and moods. The propensity to suspend judgment, to think before acting. So again, lots of conflict, if you think about it. If people aren't self-managing, aren't very aware of themselves, don't know what their triggers are, what the conflict is about, and then they're not self-managing. That causes conflict. It escalates conflict. The more self-awareness that you have, the more self-management, the better. And then on the social side, so this is your ability, your EQ, with other people. You've got social awareness, the ability to understand the emotional makeup of other people, skill in treating people according to their emotional reactions. That's empathy. So again, that's very important, that if somebody maybe responds in a way, a negative way, for example, to something you've said or done, that you are empathetic, that you actually don't jump at the conversation if they're resisting something or they're saying something, that you actually try and understand things from their point of view, that you try to allay their fear. Again, the more social awareness you have, the better you're going to be at dealing with conflict and diffusing conflict. And then at the bottom there, how we handle relationships, our social skills, or proficiency in managing relationships and building networks, an ability to find common ground and build rapport. So again, these are all the sort of building blocks of reducing or diffusing conflict. You know, the more you have of EQ, the better you will be at diffusing conflict.
And Mora, wouldn't it be safe to say that EQ is learned? So EQ develops and grows. This is not something that's static. It's about how much you practice EQ, and then your capacity to adapt your behaviors and so on to other people is a function of this. But it is something that's learned. It is something that's developed. It's not something that's fixed. And therefore, the kind of things you're talking about, the coaching, the workshops, the team developments, can have a serious impact on this in helping people grow and develop their EQ, and as a consequence, mitigate conflict or turn it into a more positive, creative force.
Yeah, absolutely. But we all know people who are naturally have very high EQ, and, you know, who find it easier in a conflict situation, for example, to diffuse it or to, you know, to see from the other person's point of view and understand it. So while it can be learned, and absolutely, because we are all becoming, which is a fantastic thing that's happening in society, not just in the workplace, we're all becoming much more aware of each other and, you know, more sensitive to people's points of view. And although I know social media, lots of people are talking now about the trolling and all of that, but I think what's going to happen there is that it's going to, because that causes conflict, obviously, that is, you know, it's outside of the workplace. But I think it's going to be, governments are going to have to step in and, you know, set laws and stuff like that. So we have a poll, I think, Porrick, here, if you want to set it up for me. I'm just interested in the people who are here, you know, your experience of EQ leadership in your organization. Do you think it's very high on the basis of what we just talked about there? Or is it, you know, is it low? Yeah, we're seeing it. Oh my goodness, here it's all coming in. It's interesting. Yeah, 13% is very high, 46%. That's not too bad, I guess. I think there's been a lot, there's a lot more in corporate culture now. There's a lot more emphasis on developing culture and people-centered culture. And that's a 47, 41, and 13. But I mean, the 41 is bad there because, you know, it's quite high, you know, for the times that we live in, because we're so aware of, you know, teamwork and culture and all of that. There's such a high awareness of it. So that's interesting.
We're saying here, Mora, that only 12%, only 4 people of the 51 who are here today at the moment who've answered this survey or this little poll, only 4 are actually saying that it's very high.
Yeah, no.
Yeah, okay. I mean, just again, it's not a great result. I mean, 41% are saying it's very low, or that it's low.
Yes. Well, obviously, there's still a lot of work that has to be done. That's the case. You know, there's a lot of work that has to be done around this area, around developing higher EQ in leaderships, in management, and in cultures and that. Okay, so I want to talk now about part of that. You know, we talked about self-awareness, particularly self-awareness is very important. So I want to talk about triggers, and there's been a lot of talk in the last few years about triggering moments and triggering incidents. And I think it's really good because people are really understanding now that, you know, it's another way for people to tune into themselves and understand the things that trigger them and that. So triggers are those super reactive places inside us that become activated by someone's behaviors or comments. When triggered, we may either withdraw emotionally or respond in an aggressive or a passive-aggressive way. So, I mean, this happens in workplaces all the time. And when I do workshops, I actually love this triggers bit because when I start asking people what their triggers are, I mean, it's like a tsunami, which is fantastic because everybody's quite open about what really annoys them in work, you know, and it can be anything from, you know, somebody interrupting you at a meeting, somebody waving or putting their hand up when you're speaking, you know, people always being late for a meeting, you know, if you've set up a meeting or something at the workplace, you know, things like people taking a call when you're talking to them, which can make you feel really, you know, can make you feel quite triggered. and people rolling their eyes. I mean, it can be anything, leaving the office. And really, some of the ones that a lot of people find very triggering about people they're working with are things like messy kitchens and, leaving the microwave, leaving egg on the microwave and all sorts of things like that. I'd actually be interested if people wanted to put in the chat box anything that I haven't mentioned here, something that really triggers them in work, that they've become aware or they have become aware that they find it very, very triggering and very upsetting. So if there's if anybody wants to, Porrick, you can read them out afterwards. If there's anybody wants to put in a few of their triggers, I'd be interested in hearing them. Yeah.
Doesn't this relate as well? Oh, I see this clicking pens, repetitive noises in the office, cancelling a meeting at the last time. It's hilarious. Actually,
oh yeah, so sorry.
That's one that really bugs me.
What, clicking pens?
No, cancelling the meeting at the last time.
Oh yeah,
I'm all ready for the meeting and I have the time allotted to it. I hate waste. Interesting. That brings me, actually, this cancelling meeting brings me to a point I want to ask you about. Is one of the big triggers related to your driving force, your motivators, what you value, what's important to you, and somehow or other somebody else not acknowledging what you think is important, or behaving in a way that you think is not important, or focusing on something that you think is not important, or dismissing something that you think is important? How big is that in this trigger scenario?
Yeah, I mean, it's like because we're human, sometimes people will do things that will, but because we like that person or we're more disposed to them, do you know what I mean? That can happen sometimes, that we don't mind if that person interrupts us. For example, if somebody's interrupting, we don't, because maybe we have that type of relationship with that person where they can't wait until you finish the sentence they're telling you. And then we mightn't like as much or have that type of, we're very complicated, that social relation. Do you know what I mean? We might have a different type of relationship with someone else and they start interrupting us and we get completely, annoyed about it. So I think it probably has to do with, what I would say to people is question yourself and say, look, like I would find messy kitchens and somebody not taking their turn in the kitchen, when you're in an office situation and people have rotas and all that, I would find that really annoying after a while. But, some people don't mind that at all. They just wouldn't even notice. They would say, oh, what are you talking about? What's the big issue? What's the problem? But that can cause a lot of problems in interpersonal relationships, so even small things like that can lead to bigger conflict. That actually people feel it's unfair, or they're being treated disrespectfully, or they've been excluded, whatever it is. So I think communication is very important around that, and regular, in an office situation, that there are regular meetings and, discussions around it. And if, people do feel annoyed, that there is a team meeting or group meeting and say, look, this
I launched the poll there for you, Mora, your third poll. What are you personally triggered by? And you can see, we see the results popping up there. I'm going to post them up there in a moment, and you can tell me. I'm actually looking at them. I don't know if you can see them, Mora, can you?
Yeah, I can't see the results, but I've got the poll up here on my screen.
Yeah, so they are feeling excluded, not being respected, not being communicated to, too much change and too much speed.
Yeah.
I'm going to ask you more, based on your experience, what do you think is going to be the biggest one, or the highest one?
This group is quite different already today, so I wouldn't like to take a bet on it. I think I think being excluded sometimes can be a big one. It can trigger people. Repeatedly in offices, if people feel that they're not included in things, not being respected, that can, over time, it can start off with maybe feeling a little bit confident. Oh, right, not being communicated to. Yeah, of course.
And I wonder more if they're not being communicated with this remote working and the way everything has changed right now, if that might have something to do with that.
Yeah, I mean, actually, Porrick, if people could put that in the chat box, that would be very helpful. What Porrick's saying there is it not being communicated to? Has this become worse for you? Do you feel more in conflict about this since COVID, since, the working from home or the hybrid working? Is this, more of a problem? I'm looking, so that's 66%. Yeah, and I mean, not communicating properly obviously does cause conflict. It causes all kinds of conflict in organizations where, you know, we're talking about, when I was talking about strategy earlier, that, you know, people aren't being told what's happening, what's the plan.
Yeah.
And then they start to feel very anxious about it. They feel like they're not being respected. They haven't been consulted. There's no buy-in. So, you know, in change, when there's change, and everything has changed now in business, that's a huge issue. And it's a huge watch out for leaders and leadership teams to actually say, look, we need to communicate with people. Even if we don't know the full plan, we need to communicate and tell them, this is what we're thinking. Things may change again, because that's always a big problem, not being communicated.
So tell us, Mora, how do we deal with this?
So, well, we can look in a few minutes. We'll look at the SCARF model, which is a structured way of dealing with conflict. And I mean, there's obviously a micro level of dealing with conflict, and then a macro level in an organization, which is what I was talking about, having proper structures, and that's more complicated than that. But I'm looking here also at not being respected and excluded, and too much change and too much speed. Well, they're quite low, but I suppose people are choosing out of the 5 which are the most popular, or the ones that they experience the most. So if we look at we'll talk about the SCARF model now. So this was developed by a neuroscientist called David Rock. And it's a way, if you have conflict, I suppose with a team or a one-on-one conflict, to look at a structured way, if you like, of saying, how do I reduce the conflict? What's going on in that? So we've talked about what's occurring, how conflicts occurs, task and process, or relational, and obviously the relational is coming up higher. We've talked about EQ, we've talked about triggers, and now we're going to talk about an actual scientific model for this. So if we look at it here, destructive versus productive outcomes. Destructive conflicts are those where the parties are unhappy with the outcomes and feel that they have lost. Destructive conflicts often escalate and destroy relationships. And we all know that. I'm sure we've all experienced that in the workplace, where we might have had a fantastic relationship with our boss or a peer, a team member, and then whatever occurred, it might have been around a project, it might have been around something personal, a conflict occur and the relationship changed. And then conversely to that, productive conflicts leave the parties feeling satisfied. Productive conflicts involve creating a collaborative transformation of the elements that cause the conflict. So I suppose, again, what we're looking at is what's causing the conflict. I mean, you really need to analyze that, to start making changes. So this is what David Rock came up with, was the SCARF model, a neuroscience model. So SCARF stands for status, certainty, autonomy, relatedness, and fairness. Okay, so the status would be perceived unimportance to others. So in that situation of conflict, that your opinion doesn't matter. Do you know what I mean? You weren't communicated with. That's going to cause conflict. Uncertainty. So that can be uncertainty around, the project is going too fast, too slow. There isn't enough money. There isn't enough people to do the work. They keep changing who's in charge of the project in a workplace situation. And people start to feel uncertain, and some people are really good with change and can change at the drop of a hat, and some people are just not good with change. And that's the thing that a leadership and a manager has to balance all the time, is in a mixed team. You've got different types of people, you've got different personalities, and some people are very good at change and uncertainty. They can quite like it. Some people makes them more creative, and some people don't like it at all. And I think what's happened in the last year and a half with COVID is that we are all a little bit triggered from it. And in the workplace, because it's just been change. I mean, everybody's had to deal with so much change. And, plans being changed, even with the government, false endings. Yes, COVID is over. No, actually, it's not over. No, you can take your mask off. No, do you know what I mean? So I think we need to be kinder to ourselves now, because I think in society and then in the workplace, we're coming in. you know, there's a lot of uncertainty around, and that causes conflict. It causes anxiety and stress and then conflict.
And Mora, isn't this as well, just to jump in for this with the psychometrics again for a moment, isn't this where psychometrics can be very helpful? Because understanding another person, understanding what works and what doesn't work for them. I mean, for example, I've got a particular profile. I deal with uncertainty quite comfortably, but many people I've worked with do not, and they don't like change. They like to know what's going to happen. They like to be involved in the decision-making process, and I'm not very good at doing that. But at least I know that that's what they're like, and as a consequence, I can modify my behaviors. I can be more active or more aware in that space. And doesn't that really help?
Yeah, it does. I mean, I'm a great believer in psychometrics. I really think it's a very quick way to into somebody, their personality. And absolutely, like if you're a manager and you've got a couple of people who are very, don't like change, well, then if you like, your responsibility in managing those people is to actually explain it more. You need to understand that that person needs more reassurance because, they don't handle change very well.
Isn't this what high EQ actually means?
Yes.
That's what it means. It's the capacity to go to where somebody is,
absolutely,
go to where they are and deal with them appropriately.
Yeah, exactly. So it's not one for all. You have a team and everybody's treated the same. You have to understand that each person is different, and that you've got to be empathetic and help people through things, whatever it is, the uncertainty. So on SCARF, if we get back to it, you've got status, certainty, autonomy. Okay, so autonomy is perceived lack of control. So again, we can see that example when we're talking about, COVID and hybrid working and remote working, and what are the changes? All this uncertainty is just making people feel very anxious, and then it can lead to conflict. That people, maybe even people who were ordinarily would have rolled with the punches and said there's just been a lot of change, and in organizations as well, just that perceived lack of control can be a huge problem. So again, leaderships and managers in the SCARF model need to understand that and say, well, look, drill down into what in this team, or what's going on, what are the triggers, what are people feeling in conflict about. The R in SCARF is relatedness, so feelings of isolation. So if somebody feels like they've been excluded, or they weren't communicated with, or they haven't been asked their opinion, or they've been sidelined, it can happen. They were involved in meetings and then suddenly they're excluded. That's going to cause conflict. And it may be a passive aggressive conflict, as I talk about, at meetings where they're not getting involved, or it can be even a very aggressive conflict, where somebody's actively fighting and having arguments and being really obstructive. So again, for leaderships and managers and team leaders and stuff like that, and even people interpersonally, to kind of understand that, like, what is going on, like what's going on in this situation? Why is this person, behaving like that if you're managing somebody, but also for yourself, if you're in that situation, why am I feeling like this? Writing down, well, it's because of this, because of this. I feel isolated. I feel, that I'm not being included. And the last part of it is fairness, perceived unfairness. And this is can be quite a big one, actually, for causing conflict. Certainly in some of the situations that I've kind of mediated on, if somebody feels, well, I'm being singled out, or I've been given extra work, or I'm not, that's unfair, I'm being asked to do more than somebody else. And sometimes that can be perceived, sometimes when you have the discussion about it, it might be, well, actually, everybody is doing exactly the same. It may be something else as well. But again, for a manager or a leader, it's around really discovering that, finding out what's underneath this, what's happening with this conflict in this team, with this person in this team, what's going on, what are the things that are triggering that person, what's causing the conflict. Okay, so key elements that are generally present for a conflict to occur. We've talked about them a lot already. So parties in a conflict need to be interdependent. The behavior of one affects the other. Perceived differences, again, that's huge, you know, not being communicated with, being excluded, not being respected. Sense of opposition. The conflict was expressed in some fashion, acting out expression we talked about, and the emotion is negative. So obviously conflict is going to be a negative emotion. And again, we as managers, leaders, we need to understand why is that. Okay, so I've just a poll, Porrick, you're putting it up there on SCARF. So the SCARF and the perceived unimportance. I just asked people in conflict situations that you have experienced, what were, oh yeah, here it comes. What were the, you know, what was the number one thing that you kind of felt in terms of what made you bring you into conflict or conflict that you've experienced? Okay, so we're still working away here. Yeah, it's interesting. So are we, oh, still going. So perceived unimportance to others, 35. And yeah, 50. You see, I do think unfairness is actually a big thing. And then it's really down to the parties involved to really say, is it unfair? Because sometimes there is unfairness going on, you know, and sometimes a leader or a manager has to actually admit that they might be treating somebody unfairly. Do you know what I mean? That they actually might prefer somebody else, or they might like, you know, in a particular team and stuff like that. So I think it's always really good when people sit down and, you know, honestly identify what's going on, obviously listening. So perceived unfairness, yeah, I mean, yeah, that is, it's kind of the number one thing that we find with this, with conflict. Yeah, great, I'm just going to move on. So, okay, so techniques to self-regulate and resolve conflict. So we've got the SCARF model, and you can look at that as it's saying, well, what's going on in this situation, you know, all the different parts of it. So, you know, if there's a one-on-one conflict, I mean, obviously conflict can be enormous in a big organization. Do you know what I mean? It might be in a team, it might be departmental, it could be, you know, with different line managers and stuff like that. I suppose the first thing is you've got to analyze, you know, what's going on and where it's going on. If you were in a situation of a one-on-one conflict, say between two people, like a manager or two peers, what you would, a really good thing to do actually is swapping seats, because it's amazing the different perspectives that come, obviously after people have talked about what they're in conflict about, you know, what, and people have listened. So you absolutely have to be able to listen if you're in a situation with somebody where you're trying to resolve a conflict. So they need to be able to talk. And if you're, you know, if you're managing this person, for example, or if you're a peer, you can't be interrupting and say, no, that's not true, whatever. You have to actually listen. And, you know, you have to listen and say, without, you know, emotion, with empathy if you can, and say, right, I'm going to listen to everything you say, and then we're going to go talk through everything, you know, everything that you feel is causing the conflict or is upsetting you. Be aware of triggers, both sets of triggers. Let's say if it's in interpersonal, that, you know, you might be triggered by something too, because conflict, you know, you mightn't agree with, obviously, with something that somebody is saying to you. So if you're the senior person, you've got to actually really take responsibility for yourself, for your own emotions as well around it. Be open and set boundaries. So again, it's really interesting, you know, in terms of one-on-one conflict, how you can resolve it a bit using, I mean, I think the SCARF model is very, very good. I'm interested if anybody else here has any other sort of ways that they have found has worked in terms of resolving conflict. I think in organizations they will do, you know, a lot of, even before conflict kind of starts, lots of away days and social activities and team meetings. And I suppose with hybrid working and working from home, that's kind of stopped. You know, there's been less social, less sort of you know, physical seeing each other. And it'll be interesting to see what companies find with that when people are back in the office in the hybrid. You know, how they're feeling about it. Is it reducing conflict? You know, are people feeling better to be back in the office and that? Okay, so we've come to the end of the talk. Porrick, are there any questions that you wanted to ask, or if anybody wants to put in the chat any questions or any observations that they want to make about what we've discussed?
Yeah, but the first thing, Mora, I've just posted in the chat for everybody. I've posted your contact details. You can flick to the next slide if you want, so they're up there as well in front of people on the screen, Mora. And okay, they're not there.
I don't have the slide with their contact details on them, but anyway.
That's okay.
Yeah.
I've posted them in the chat, guys. So I've posted Mora's contact details and I've posted mine. I've also posted a link to that trimetric CQ report that's available to you, and details what to do with that. Regarding, I have a couple of questions here that came into me, Mora, and one of them I think is sort of interesting. And they're asking the question, in this, again, it's working from home, which is not surprising. They're asking the question, in this working from home scenario that we're in right now, how have, in your experience as a coach and as a trainer and working with companies, how different are things now in terms of the stresses that people are experiencing? It wasn't the isolations. I'm looking at here. It's not the isolation so much that somebody's asking about. They're more asking about the question, just the general stresses of working from home. And how can you understand when somebody's not working with you, when they're in a different room, they're not even in the same place? How do you understand these things and how do you address them? Have you got techniques to help engage the team when they're working remotely?
Well, I think a lot of people were doing, I know earlier in the year I was talking to people, they were doing more social things, and they were doing, like managers, some managers I talked to were doing things like sending little gifts to people, you know, keeping the team together, maybe having film club together, or a Friday evening Zoom. Wasn't ideal, to be honest with you, because, you know, you're on Zoom meetings all the time. So there was quite a lot of that. And then I think larger companies were doing things like giving half days and, you know, letting people, so that they still had a part of the team. Managers, obviously, as a coach, most of my work is one-on-one, and it's very effective. Managers having their one-on-ones with people, you know what I mean, really tuning into somebody. Really, really important, because now, in a lot of cases, you know, what people say to me is that, you know, like you could sort out an issue or a quick question in 30 seconds in the office, and it might take 3 or 4 emails in, you know, with the remote working. So, you know, that has made things more complicated. But I think a lot of companies did do things like that, spent a lot of time thinking about the non-work, you know what I mean, to try and keep the team together. And then different people having book clubs and movie clubs, and, you know, exercising and going out and meeting each other and stuff. But I suppose the biggest thing to reduce conflict for people is communication. I think that leaderships and teams, managers and that need to communicate with their people, you know, around what's going to be the setup. There's anxiety around health and safety. I know there's been a lot of companies spending a lot of money, of course, coming out of capital budgets on accommodation, you know, and on health and safety, and on, you know, having social distancing. Because people are worried about that. They are worried about, am I safe, you know, when I go back into the office and that. But I think there are a lot of people who want to go back into the office. Obviously, younger people do, because, you know, if they're in flats in Dublin and there's 3 or 4 of them and they're working in their room, that's very stressful. You know, I mean, it is very, very stressful. Well, so I think communication, Porrick, is the #1 thing.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's interesting, Mora. I agree with you, actually. And we ran with, we were having another webinar in 3 weeks' time with Breda Flood from ICOS and Carla and Smith from CAS Coaching. And we're going to be talking around the whole area of, I suppose, working with a team, when you're working remotely with a team, a program that we developed with ICOS to actually deliver to them. But what's interesting about the program was a program around a communications program, basically a value, what value do I bring to the team type of program, done in modules. But what was interesting about the program, I think really interesting for the feedback we got, was the very act of doing the exercise with the team, talking about the things you're talking about, behavioral styles, driving forces, the different ways of working, what works and doesn't work for different people, and having that conversation, that in itself was valuable. But the fact they just did the exercise itself was perhaps as valuable as what we did in the exercise. We got very, very positive feedback from the companies who did the exercise. People said, you know, it was great because I'm working remotely and now I've met the team again, and we'll be talking about ourselves and how we're getting on, our styles and whatever, and I have a better understanding of my team members, and now I understand when so-and-so emails me or when so-and-so phones me, what to expect and how to react. Because of course, communications now with working from home are quite different. We're getting short one-line emails, we're getting a quick phone calls, we're getting text messages. I'm getting text messages all the time that seem rude to me. And the person's not being rude, they're saying, send me such and such. There's no hello, there's no goodbye, there's no please, there's no thank you, there's nothing. So understanding the styles, we found the feedback from that was very positive.
I think, again, going back to the EQ, you know, it's around like giving people a break and understanding people, and as I said, communication is the number one thing. It really is. You know, if people feel that they're being communicated, but also understanding that there's differences in people, that not everybody is the same. We all have different personalities, and that we need to take that into consideration, that we're all different and different people have different needs and worries. I think the one-on-ones are very, very important, as well as team, obviously, but one-on-ones with managers and that are very, very important. They're essential, actually, because what somebody is feeling this month might be the same as they felt last month. So you really need to be in touch with people one-on-one, and they may not say it in a group. You know, lots of times people have private things that are causing them conflict, and they may not be able to talk about it or want to talk about it in front of a group. So a manager needs to have a combination of the two things, obviously, because you want to have the team working together, you want to be communicating with them, but then you also want to be in touch with the person as well directly.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I'm just following in directly from what you're saying. There's a comment here from Som Woosh saying, one important thing is about timing to resolve these conflicts. If you try to resolve at the very early stage of conflict, the emotions will be high and it will not be easy to resolve it. However, giving it a little time to settle down the emotion will make the resolution a bit easier. And it's interesting, I agree with that actually, but I also think, Ali, you're one-on-one. I think, again, I want to hear what your thoughts are. I'm speaking here as the amateur, you're the expert. But I mean, if you look at conflict, is it a question of addressing conflict head on, straight on, first, immediately? Or if you let it sit for a while, does it fester? Is what this person's saying here correct or not? What's your view?
Yeah, sometimes, you see, sometimes it's good if you, I do agree. What was it? Was it Omar? What was the name of the person you sent?
Som Rouge.
Som Rouge. Okay, very lovely name.
Yeah, lovely name. I thought it was an interesting name myself.
Yeah, lovely. I think it depends, Porrick. I think that some conflicts need to be dealt with very quickly, because I think, and often in a conflict situation, if you let things, go on, which often happens in organizations, that people don't want to deal with the conflict, and they say, oh yeah, well, I'll deal with that next week. And the person who's in conflict might actually feel worse then, because they feel like, well, I'm not being taken seriously. Nobody's reacting to this. Nobody cares. Nobody cares what I think. So I do think that sometimes it can be, let's cool off. And, if somebody has, let's say, a row, and they need to cool off, I definitely think that's true. But I think there is a balance between the timing, between actually dealing with stuff and not dealing with stuff. And we've all had managers and bosses and colleagues who haven't dealt with stuff. And
another one, Mora, isn't there another one where the person actually doesn't express the problem? So I mean, giving back the whole thing of understanding behaviors and driving force and EQ and all this kind of good stuff, isn't there an issue here where somebody actually, a particular style, for example, bottles up the the conflict issue, whatever it is, the resentment or the frustration or the feeling not being listened to.
Yeah.
They don't actually share it, and unless you ask them the question, unless you're engaging with them and you have some sort of some modality where you have regular conversations with people and you actually ask the questions, only then will you hear for it sometimes, and you don't even know the conflict exists.
Yeah, absolutely. So again, that's a personality thing where, you know, some people are very, very good at communication when they're unhappy about something, and some people are just not very good. Sometimes people don't even know that they're upset about something. You know, their behavior starts to, they haven't really identified that I'm very upset about this, and then they become more upset. I think with conflict, I think sooner rather than later would be my thing. I get that sometimes you need to let things calm down, but I think you need to have a plan that, listen, let's just calm down. Let's talk about this in an hour or tomorrow or what, let's have a meeting tomorrow or whatever and stuff like that. Where conflict, it definitely escalates, is where people just have the conflict and then the person doesn't deal with it. I mean, I think that really causes much more trouble, because I deal quite a bit with people as well who are moving jobs and leaving jobs, and I see it all the time where, you know, they just, you know, had a brilliant, it was all working very well, and then suddenly something happened. But it generally isn't one thing, but the big problem is that the boss or whatever it is isn't respecting them. They feel they're not listening to them. They've had a meeting with them. They've told them how, do you know what I mean? They've told them that was a month ago, that was 2 months ago. So I think that, you know, people need to deal with stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, but sure, this gets back to the issue of understanding yourself and understanding others, and using things again like psychometric, but other things as well. Just engaging in processes that allow you to actually understand yourself and understand others. If you're completely unaware that somebody wants to be involved or engaged in the conversation, they want to be part of the decision-making process, they want to be informed, and so if you're not even aware of those things, well, you're not going to do anything about them.
Yeah, yeah. But again, that's the job of a good manager or a good leader to deal with, to have the empathy, to understand that if somebody, to notice a change in somebody's behavior or their attitude, and to, you know, to deal with it and stay. It's not always possible. Sometimes in business is very busy and people are very busy, and definitely the fact that people weren't in the office, you can see that conflicts could be happening, and people, you know, even one-on-ones over Zooms and that, you know, somebody mightn't feel comfortable to talk about something, and, you know, a month could go by, 2 months go by, you know, and then it's escalating, or it's gone on a long time and the attitude starts to change. So yeah, I think it's been very challenging it's been a challenging time in business. I think managers and leaders are going to come back from it, obviously. But yeah, I think it's a challenging time, and it's a time for people to kind of acknowledge that we've all, you know, we've all been struggling, and it's been very difficult for us all. And I think the managers and leaders who can do that and say, look, I don't have all the answers. I remember myself when I had teams of people working for me, and if I noticed that I was getting stressed out or I was getting kind of demanding, it was always great, because I would say to somebody, look, I'm really sorry. I'm just, you know, this client is very demanding, or the timeline is too short. And the relief from somebody else, I used to always notice this, you know, the relief people feel when you say, sorry, or you say to them, I noticed that you know, you weren't happy about that. You know, I think when somebody, a manager does that, it's such a brilliant thing for both people in it, or for a team, because it just changes. People kind of go, oh my God, they've noticed, you know what I mean? They've noticed that I'm upset, or they've acknowledged that they're vulnerable themselves and they don't have all the answers. And we don't have all the answers, you know, that's the reality of life. We don't have all the answers.
Well, Mora, I think with that was really good, and I really, really appreciate it. I see a lot of good feedback coming in there. That was a wonderful webinar, Mora, really, really insightful, really interesting. I learned a lot. I hope that our participants did as well. Again, for everybody's information, I've just posted again our contact details and the link for that free assessment that we're giving you for showing up today. I hope you enjoyed it. We look forward to seeing you again at some stage in the future for another webinar. And in the meantime, I'd like to thank Mora Byrne. Thank you very much, Mora.
Yeah.
great webinar.
Thanks, Porrick. And I'd just like to say to anybody that's, if you've questions or anything like that for me around a conflict or resolving or coaching programs or something, just email me mora@yourbusinesssmartcoach.net. Porrick has posted my details anyway.
Yeah,
so you've seen me now, you've met me now, you know what I'm like now. So, you know, ask me anything basically.
Yeah, your contact details are in the chat for everybody, Mora.
Great.
So I'm sure they've all grabbed them.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you so much for coming today, because I know everybody's really busy, and I really, really appreciate it. And have a good day. Have a nice weekend. I know it's not the weekend till tomorrow, but have a nice weekend.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Mora. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Porrick. Bye-bye.